Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this GEO tutorial. We're delighted to be welcomed by Richard today from the Field Studies Council. I'm Harriet from the GA. I'm going to be administrating today, so you might see me pop up in the comments later. Richard is a senior tutor from FSC Blencathra, Cumbria, and he's going to be introducing you to some of the opportunities available for independent investigations today within the topic of carbon. We'll discuss some of the theory around carbon, data collection skills. There will also be some interactive tasks, so make sure you're ready to answer any questions that come up. You might find it useful to have a notepad and pen throughout the session to make notes. And as I said, there's a chat box to the right-hand side. If you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please leave them in there, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. Just remember, obviously, to keep them polite and related to the session. The recording of this session will be available for those watching live afterwards. This will be emailed to you tomorrow morning, and a copy of the presentation is also available on the GEO website. I will pass over to Richard now to get started.
Cool. Thank you, Harriet. So, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Harriet said there, we're going to be looking at opportunities for your independent investigations if you're thinking about investigating carbon. So we're going to look at a few different things, which I'll go through in a second. As Harriet said, you might want a little notepad to jot down some ideas. If you do download the presentation and watch it again later, you'll find some extra notes and things in the notes section of the PowerPoint, a few links and things that might be useful as well. So do have a good explore of it if you do download it. So what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. So first off, we're just going to think about the carbon cycle as a thing, and particularly focusing on which bits of it we can actually investigate, as it is such a big concept. Then we might think about some of the environments that are around and where is actually carbon stored in the places we have NEAs. So where can we investigate? Then I'm going to take you through a few range of fieldwork techniques and methods you can use for measuring carbon stores if you're going to go out and do some fieldwork on this subject. And then to finish off, we're going to think about how you might kind of frame your investigation. So what might be the context, background to your investigation. And then finally, give you an opportunity to think about what sort of environments you do actually have around you that you could use to investigate this topic. As Harriet said, I'll ask a few questions as we go. So if you are able to throw some answers into the comments, please do. That will help us along nicely. Most of the time, just ask for fairly little short answers, so you should be able to quickly type in a few kind of thoughts and ideas into the comments box. So let's go to that first part, the carbon cycle itself. So carbon cycle is, as you may know, an absolutely huge cycle, going everything from carbon stored in the atmosphere through to carbon stored in rocks, fossil fuels, deep ocean sediments, and then everything from the trees outside. And that carbon obviously moves around through burning it, transfers between vegetation in the atmosphere, etc. So what I'd like you to think about, just quickly, looking at the carbon cycle we've got on the screen there in front of you, which parts of that cycle are accessible to us as geographers doing our investigations, and which bits do you think you could actually measure in this in the carbon cycle? So some bits are obviously super easy. Other bits, maybe like the deep ocean, might not be so accessible. So if you've got any ideas, just throw some into the comments. Just taking ideas off of that carbon cycle there. What do you think you could investigate? And then we'll have a look at a few methods we can do on some of those things next. I'll just give you a moment. Excellent. I can see some comments coming in. I do have a slight delay on them, so I do have to kind of pause a little bit longer. Cool, so we've got the idea of their carbon in trees and tree planting schemes. That's fantastic. Cool, size of different carbon stores relative to one another. Brilliant. Which specific stores could we measure on there, though? Are we going to be measuring fossil fuel stores? Are we going to be measuring ocean stores? Cool. Let's have a look at some of those things then. So on my carbon cycle here, I've circled soil and vegetation as two that are very accessible for us to investigate. Everywhere we go, there's often soil underneath our feet if we're in a park or field out in the countryside, or even out and about in town. And there's normally vegetation all around us as well. Some of the others we may be able to kind of think about in our investigations, but they're quite large, either large transfers or large stores, which are very tricky for us as A-level students to be able to measure. Particularly things to do with, obviously, the ocean. That's not particularly accessible for us. The atmosphere, it can be measured, and you can probably find data on it, but not totally easy for us to be able to measure that ourselves. Oh, I see a comment there about peat as well. I'm going to talk a bit about peat, a fantastic carbon store, which we've got a lot of in our country. So, thinking about different locations, and question here: why might the amount of carbon stored be different in different environments? So we all live in different parts of the UK, and you've all got access to lots of different environments around you. Maybe places you go and visit people, or even just the places immediately outside. Here I've got two examples. On the left-hand side, you've got a Lake District scene. I live in Cumbria, so that's just down the road from me. You've got Grasmere there and the surrounding hills. And then you've got more of a lowland, almost kind of typical English countryside scene on the right-hand side. So the amount of carbon stored in those two locations is going to be different. The Lake District scene on the left probably stores far more carbon than the scene on the right-hand side in the kind of typical arable farmland. Just have a think. What are the differences between those two things that mean those two locations that mean that there's probably more carbon in that Lake District scene? Again, you can pop a few ideas in the comments. What can you see in that left-hand photo that might be things that are storing more carbon than maybe that right-hand scene? Of course, some nice comments coming in there. So greater biomass in the trees rather than crops and grass. So definitely trees, as we'll talk about in a bit, hold a huge amount of carbon within their trunks and their roots, etc. And they're going to be holding a lot more than, say, arable crops on the right-hand side. comment there on the potential for more carbon in the Lake District scene as well, compared to the right-hand scene. Yeah, so you've got more places it can be stored, haven't you? You've got trees, you've got a lake actually there as well. One thing you might not be able to make out without knowing this place is the top of the hills, where I'm kind of indicating with my mouse up here. These are large boggy areas that contain a lot of carbon stored in peat bogs and really, really deep deep soils. Fab. So I've got a few ideas I had jotted down here. So one, vegetation that people have identified there. So difference between woodland and crops. You might have kind of pastoral grassland rather than crops as well. That'll be another difference. So areas where sheep and cattle graze. Moorland, and then bog environments as well. Each of those will have a different amount of carbon within them. Bog being on the right-hand side, the far biggest one. And then woodlands probably close behind there. So all across the UK, you've got a big range of different environments. You may not have access to all of those, but you definitely have a few different ones around you. Other things, see how that land is used, obviously it influences the vegetation you've got there as well. So whether it's a recreational, agricultural, or more of an urban setting. So obviously urban settings, far fewer stores, we've only got a few trees around, bits of parkland. Agricultural, recreational might seem quite similar, big grassy areas, but depending on the crops you've got there, you might find quite different amounts. And then finally, one thing I thought about as well is the climate of the area. In the Lake District scene on the left-hand side, it's quite a very wet area, and because it's so wet, that means you get a lot of waterlogged ground, which has the potential to store a lot of carbon in bogs on top of the hills. This next map I'm about to show you just here shows you kind of what those differences are across the country. The light colours, so sorry to show you, this is topsoil carbon concentration. So scientists have measured the amount of carbon in the topsoil of places all across the country, and this map is showing that. So the lighter areas, such as here, just north of London, you've got much less carbon stored, so it's grams per kilogram in your topsoil. And the darker areas, let's say like in Wales and Scotland through the Pennines, you've got higher amounts of carbon potentially stored in your topsoil. So lots of different areas, huge amounts around you. And depending on where you are in the country on there, you might be near, say, one of these very high carbon stored areas, or over one of these much lesser ones, but you still will have variety around where you live. The UKSO, where this map is from, that's the UK Soil Observatory. If you download this PowerPoint, you'll find a link to that map in the notes underneath this slide. Sounds geeky, but quite an interesting website to go onto. They've got this great little map viewer where you can look at loads and loads of different soil maps, lots of them relating to carbon, land use, biomass, things like that. So definitely worth checking out. So we're going to think of a few different methods that you can use for measuring carbon stores. We're going to focus mainly on soil and vegetation, particularly trees. And then once we've looked at those, we'll have a little think about the kind of context of an investigation. So there's my nice little trowel of soil there on the right. Cool. So measuring carbon in soil, you can do that by collecting soil samples from a location. And simply just with a trowel, like in that photo, you can just dig a bit of topsoil out, collect samples from wherever you're investigating, and start to work out the amount of carbon in them. To do this, there's a few steps to it. The full details, I'm going to link a website where you can find instructions of how to do these. Field Studies Council has a useful geography fieldwork website where a lot of these methods are taken from and explained in a bit more detail. But I'm just going to give you a kind of a brief idea, a few ideas for now. So to work out in normal soil how much carbon you've got, first you need to dry it just to remove any water. The steps for that will be linked in the website I'll give you. And then you need to burn the soil. And this technique, as it says at the top there, is called loss on ignition. So the amount of material that is lost when you burn the soil. This is normally done in a soil oven or muffle furnace. And it needs to be an oven that can get up to near 400 degrees. Now, your ordinary oven at home won't be able to do that. You'll probably max out at like 250. But your school may have a soil oven or a muffle furnace where you can do this. Either in your science department or even maybe in your art department. Muffle furnaces are sometimes used in glasswork and things like that. So you can burn a soil for 16 hours around 400 degrees, and that should remove all of the organic material within that soil. And the organic material is what's holding all of the carbon that's been captured from the vegetation that's growing on the surface of that soil. So after you've burned it, you reweigh your samples, and the difference in weight between your pre-burnt and post-burnt sample gives you the amount of organic material that has been burnt off. Generally, in an organism, 50% of the organic matter is carbon. So if you were, for example, if you wanted to know how much carbon was in yourself, if you dried yourself out, half of your dry weight would be carbon. Don't do that. But you can very easily do that for soil by just getting a sample, removing the water, burning off the organic material, and then working out how much of that is carbon. So hopefully if you've got access to a soil oven, that will be or muffle furnace, a method that you will be able to have a go at. Next one, we're going to have a think about peat. So there's a couple of comments in my previous questions asking about peat. So if you're not familiar with peat, and you're not entirely sure what I mean when I say peat, it's slightly different to soil, and it's an accumulation of organic decaying plant matter. So in certain environments, which are particularly waterlogged, like this picture on the right-hand side, the ground is permanently wet, and when that occurs, any vegetation growing on the surface never fully decomposes when it dies. It accumulates or builds up in the ground, in the kind of wet, boggy bog, basically. And the anaerobic conditions, where there's no oxygen underneath the surface, mean the plant matter never decomposes fully. And that means all of the carbon that any plant has captured from the atmosphere is then locked away within that accumulation. And peat bogs grow, as plants die, new plants will grow on top, and they'll grow up and up and up, storing more and more carbon as they get older and older. So there's two types you're most likely to find around the UK. They are upland blanket bog, which occur in particularly wet, hilly areas, places such as Wales, the Pennines, generally in the north or the west of the country, or lowland raised bogs, which is what this picture on the right is. That is a raised bog on the coast in Cumbria. Often in kind of coastal areas, there's definitely some along the south coast of England, particularly in East Anglia, around the Norfolk Broads and the Fenland areas. You find quite a lot of raised bogs. Just for interest, why they're important to us. There's not much in the world. There's only 3% of the world's surface is covered in peat, but it does contain 30% of all soil carbon around the world. So a huge proportion of global carbon is locked up in peatlands. And the UK has 13% of all the world's blanket bog. So we've got a big chunk of that 30% within the UK. And just to give you an idea of how big that store is, our peat store is 3 billion tonnes of carbon, which is the same as all the forests in the UK, France and Germany put together. Those stats come from Moors for the Future, which is an organisation that works in the Pennines to help protect and restore blanket bogs up in the Pennines. So one big problem with our peatlands in this country is they're very, very degraded. And this example here shows what happens when a peat bog is eroded, either through often through kind of bad management of the land, really. The land might have been drained to try and dry it out to make it more better for grazing, or might have been overgrazed, which has then exposed the peat and allowed water to get in and erode it away. So there's a lot of work being done, particularly in the Pennines and other upland areas of the country, to repair bogs and refill in these areas that have been eroded out to help capture more carbon. Also, there's a nice link to the water cycle when it comes to bogs as well, as they hold so much water. They do have an effect in mitigating flooding problems further downstream if you can lock water away up in the hills and prevent it from getting downstream. So you can measure these carbon stores in peat. You have to do it slightly differently to soil. You can't burn it because it's pretty much all organic matter. You're going to end up with not much left if you burn it. So there's other ways of going around it. Let's have a look. So to know how much carbon you've got in a bog, you need to know how big your bog is. Basically, you need to know the volume of it, its depth, and the area of land that it covers. Now, bogs can be very deep. That photo I showed on the previous slide of the bog in Cumbria, that bog is thought to be about kind of 8 meters deep. More commonly, you might find them maybe 2 or 3 meters deep, depending on where you are, really. So you can get poles, like in this photograph on the right-hand side, that you can just put down into a bog. It's very soft. Anything will easily just slide into it, and then you can measure how deep it is. So what we use at the centre I teach at is threaded bar, which is a big pole with a screw thread on it. You can screw the poles together. You can buy them from a DIY store, somewhere like Screwfix or B&Q. And then you just put one into the ground, screw on another one, thread that down into the ground, and keep going until you hit the bottom. Okay. Once you hit the bottom, you can pull it out and measure how much went into the ground. So on this bog in the photograph here, we sometimes manage to get 5 1-meter poles down into the bottom of the bog. So it's pretty deep, this one we use. That's quite a fun task. It's quite messy. It's quite an enjoyable bit of field work, getting out there and finding out how deep a bog is. Definitely wear wellies if you're going to go and do this. It's very wet. To get the area, you then need to know how big your bog is. Easiest way to do that is to measure it remotely. So using Google Earth to work out how big it is. So this example here, I've got a bog that is 1.5 million square meters. That's a particularly big one. You probably want to do things on a maybe slightly smaller scale than that. So using that's a really simple way to work out how big your bog is. Once you've got that, the website I mentioned earlier, Geography Fieldwork, the FSC's Geography Fieldwork website does have instructions of how you can then turn that into an actual amount of carbon. Basically, what you then need to do is a couple of calculations to remove the amount of water from your bog, and then work out how much of the matter left will be carbon. Okay. Generally, a bog is 85% water, 15% plant matter. So once you know how big it is, you can work out the percentage of that. That should be plant matter. Then you know half of the plant matter should be carbon. As I said, there's nice instructions of how to do that on our website. Just if you're thinking, that's all very good, but I have no idea where a bog is or where I could actually do anything like this. This little map here just gives you an idea of all the peatlands and bogs of England. So the red ones, the blanket bogs in the north mainly, and the southwest. Those are upland areas with kind of moorland environments on them. You've got the green areas, particularly over there in East Anglia and kind of through the northwest of England, Cheshire, Staffordshire, more lowland fens and bogs. And then there's a few of the yellow raised bogs. They're quite a rare environment, raised bogs. There's quite a few up in Cumbria, the northwest, and then some down in the Somerset levels as well. If you live in Wales, you're quite lucky because Wales is very wet, so there's perfect bog forming environments across pretty much the whole of the country. So you're never too far from a bog if you're in Wales. Those two maps again are referenced in the notes for this presentation. This one's from Natural England, this one's from Natural Resourced Wales. So moving on from underground to above ground, we'll have a little think about trees. Oh, I see a comment there about permafrost. Is permafrost frozen peat? Is that an issue with thawing and releasing carbon, methane through decomposition? Yes, it is. So where you've got big permafrost areas in the kind of Alaska through tundra areas of the very north, most of that is frozen peat bogs. So either blanket bog or raised bog that is frozen, and as they are thawing, they are releasing huge amounts of carbon and methane. I think there's been some interesting news recently of some of the methane is exploding out of some of the bogs in Russia, and it's leaving huge craters in the ground as the bogs are for some reason blowing up. There was an interesting article on that on the BBC recently. Yeah, so we have, 13% of the blanket bog in our country, which has been quite badly degraded. A lot of the rest of the blanket bog is locked away in permafrost up in the northern areas. So, carbon in trees. Just a kind of question to get your heads thinking first off. I'll throw some answers into the comments. Where does the carbon in a tree come from? I like the answer to this question. It always surprises me whenever I think about it. I do have a slight delay on my comments, so I'll just give it a minute to see if any answers come through. So basically, where do trees get their carbon from? Yep. See geography in your jammers there. The comment, photosynthesis or the soil. It is one of those. So the answer is mainly through photosynthesis. So trees are taking carbon dioxide out of the air, and that carbon from that carbon dioxide is locked away within the tree, which I think is quite a fun fact, that you start off with just air and you end up with a massive solid oak tree. So that's why we think when we planting trees is thought of one good solution to emitting too much carbon into the atmosphere. It will soak it up. You're taking that carbon directly out of the air and then locking it away within the tree. There we go. I can see another photosynthesis coming in there. I do have a bit of a delay. So you can very easily measure how much carbon is in a tree. Okay. I'll explain a few bits of method that you will need to do in a moment. But in different woodlands, different environments around you will all have different amounts of carbon within them. And that might be kind of something, a path you could head down in an investigation. So just having a quick think for a moment, why might the amount of carbon differ in different woodlands? So this picture of a woodland here up in Cumbria might have a very different amount of carbon to even a woodland just down the road from it, or one over the other side of the country. So yeah, if you've got any ideas in the comments again, why might the amount of carbon differ in different woodlands? What is it about a different areas or different structures of maybe woodlands, or that might give you different amounts of carbon within them? You could also think of this on an individual tree level as well. So why has the oak tree at one end of my road got a different amount of carbon to the Scots pine at the other end of my road? Cool, nice comment there about deciduous trees. Yeah, so if they're shedding their leaves, they are going to be putting some of that carbon back into the atmosphere, or it might get locked away in the soil underneath. So yeah, they're going to kind of constantly be changing the amount of carbon they actually have within them. A few other comments there. Species of tree, definitely. Yeah, that's appeared twice now. So hardwood or softwood, different densities of wood definitely have different amounts of carbon. The size of the tree, obviously a really big one there as well. A bigger tree is going to hold more carbon than a smaller carbon. So I've got that one there. Species, age of your tree. So 400-year-old oak might have a bit more in than a new little sapling. Particularly within a woodland, maybe the density of trees. So if you've got a pine plantation with huge density, that might lock in a bit more carbon than a more spacious woodland. And those might be different things you might be able to find around you. You might have different woodlands locking in different amounts of carbon due to different species, different management practices within the woodland as well, potentially could have an effect there as well. So let's have a think about how we might measure carbon in a tree. So we mentioned knowing the size of the tree. So for the method that is outlined, and this method is in the same place as the soil methods I mentioned as well. There's a link at the end of the PowerPoint to get to that website. You need to know the height of your tree. Okay, and to do that, you can do a nice little trigonometry to measure how big your tree is, how tall your tree is. So for that, you'll need to know, you need to make yourself a nice little triangle, basically. So using a clinometer, which I'll mention in a second, you can measure the angle to the top of the tree from where you're standing. If you know how far away you are from the tree, you can then calculate the height or the opposite length of your triangle there. You also need to know how tall you are as well for the height which you measure your angle from. So that can be really simply done. All you need to do is go out into the field with a clinometer and a tape measure, and then you can collect loads of data that allows you to work out amount of carbon in your tree. Species of the tree is really important because different trees will lock away carbon at different rates. As we mentioned, pine trees will behave differently to deciduous trees. So you can get yourself a useful little tree guide. This is the FOC's tree name trail that allows you to identify trees. I'm sure you could easily find an app that would allow you to identify trees. So that shouldn't be too difficult. And you need to know the circumference of your tree as well. So I think girth was mentioned there and in the comments as well. Yeah. And very simply, just as demonstrated in that photograph, you can measure how wide your tree is, or the circumference of your tree. So the bits of equipment you would need: tape measure, clinometer, and some way of identifying a tree. So the clinometer you use, that could be a piece of equipment you have at school. Often you have specific clinometers that you might use for measuring angles, or you could even just download an app. So if you've got a spirit level app on your phone, that will often tell you the angle something is as well, and you can use that as a clinometer also, which can be a nice easy way of doing it using the equipment you've already got to hand. Once you've got that information, it is then a case of working out the biomass of your tree, so then you can work out the amount of carbon that's in your tree as well. And to do that, there are instructions on the website I've mentioned already that tell you how to do this. But with just those 3 pieces of information, you should then be able to work out how much carbon is in your tree. And that can be done, yeah, for any tree, really. Other things you might want to know. If you were wanting to say know how much carbon was in a woodland, you would then want to expand your method to cover a much larger area. Now, measuring every single tree in your woodland might not be practical. So you might do a certain amount of trees within a certain area and scale up your investigation. So say measure all the trees in a hectare. It's a 100 meter by 100 meter square, or even slightly smaller. And then you could scale that up for your entire area. You can measure density, so measure kind of a ratio of how far apart trees are. Again, our geography fieldwork website has a nice way of doing that. The app I've mentioned here, Habitat, is a nice way of working out the density of a tree cover. You take a photo of the canopy of a trees, and it will tell you the percentage cover of those trees there. So there are apps that can help you out there as well. So there's a few methods. It is a little whistle-stop tour, and as I said, there are lots more instructions of how to do some of those methods online. So particularly looking at soil, peat, and trees. So next to what I wanted to talk about was just kind of framing. Oh no, I forgot a page, sorry. A couple of qualitative methods as well you might want to consider in your fieldwork. So that was all very quantitative, and it will require a few calculations to work out the amount of carbon in those. But also there's other things you might be able to observe in your landscape as well, particularly things to do with fluxes rather than stores. So the fluxes on the carbon cycle, where carbon's moving from one store through to another, really, they're not the most accessible things for us to measure. But we might be able to make observations, maybe field sketches, annotated photographs, see what's going on. Often the colour of a river can be a nice idea about how much carbon is being washed away, particularly in upland areas. So in this example here, you've got that kind of tea-stained, peaty coloured water. The darker, stronger kind of tea colour that is carbon being lost from a peat bog somewhere further upstream. So that might be something you observe out in your environment. You might find evidence of soil erosion. So one of the biggest problems in terms of soil carbon in this country is soil being lost through erosion, and that takes then carbon out of the ground, washes it through into a river, and then it's off into the sea, or it might get into the atmosphere. So moving into a more kind of a lowland example there, if you live in an area of arable fields in the winter or periods of heavy rain, maybe like last weekend, you might see water pouring off fields that aren't vegetated. So particularly ones that have been left ploughed and not revegetated over the winter. So it'd be an interesting thing to look out for in your environment. If you see scenes like that photograph there, that is soil being lost, and with it a huge amount of carbon as well. Soil forms very slowly, and that carbon won't be replaced particularly quickly if it's a field where the vegetation's then being removed through harvesting every year. You might do mapping of your environment as well. So if you're looking at different carbon stores, you might be able to see what ones you've got around you. So there's an example here of a land use map showing different deciduous, coniferous and grassland environments. You could map other ideas such as soil erosion or peatland degradation, maybe mapping schemes to improve them, or places where there's problems. Way the land is managed. So that could be everything from tree planting to capture more carbon through to the burning of heather moorland, which is a big source of carbon emissions in upland areas. So other observations out there, not just direct quantitative measurements, could definitely help support your investigation as well. So those fluxes, very difficult to measure, but you can still see evidence of them out and about. So now have a little think about, oh no, I forgot another slide. Brilliant. Yeah, this is actually really important. Thinking about the scale of your investigation. So we've already mentioned the carbon cycle is enormous, isn't it? And but some of the methods we've looked at there can be done on quite a small local scale. But one thing to consider, importantly for you, is how big do you want your investigation to be? Obviously, you cannot investigate the entire carbon cycle, but you could use. There's a few ideas of kind of different limits you could put on the area you investigate. So you could use, say, a small defined geographical area like a river catchment. And this map here on the right from the National River Flow Archive, it's a small river catchment in Cumbria, and you could base your investigation around, say, that catchment. And here you can see there's lots of different land uses I could investigate within it. The National River Flow Archive allows you to access these maps really easily. Just clicking on the data button, you can get catchment information for hundreds of catchments all across the UK. That includes Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, as well as England. You might have local developments, maybe building projects in your local area. That might be an interesting source of carbon into the atmosphere, or they might have ways they're planning on capturing carbon. Could be something interesting to investigate. You might just decide to look around your local neighbourhood or village, depending on where you live, or maybe within what's the kind of carbon cycle like within, say, an individual farm or something like that, if that's the sort of environment you have around you. One thing to consider definitely with this is permission of getting into land as well. So it might be easier to use public land, parks, public forests, places like that for your investigation. So you have to be careful if you are kind of wandering onto someone's farmland that you know that you are allowed to be there, sticking to footpaths, etc. Whilst you're doing that. But definitely, there's a wide range of places you could investigate. So thinking about a context for your investigation, made it. So basically, why might you investigate the carbon cycle? Okay, you could just go out there and measure how much carbon is in the trees of your park. Okay, but without some sort of kind of obvious reason to do that, you're going to end up with a number and maybe not much to do where you can take with that number. So just kind of thinking of different kind of sources, information you could use to help build the kind of the literature review section of your investigation. So you might have issues in the local news or national news, which could be investigated. So obviously there is the link to climate change quite prominently in this subject. There's quite a lot of talk in farming at the moment about locking more carbon and into farmland and farming in a way which enables more carbon to be captured. So here, an article about a hill farm trying to improve their soil carbon by 1% every year by changing the way they graze their land. This example here on the left, local campaigners saying that a council's plan for tree planting is not enough in terms of improving the environment, combating climate change. So that could be if you've got some local developments and things. So I think this article talks about housing development and the tree planting that's going with it, and people complaining that it's not really doing enough to offset the building. There is the big issue of our wasted peatlands up in the hills in the north of England and Wales. There's quite a lot of research going into ways of capturing more carbon in peatlands. That one's from that article there's from Geography Review. So if you have access to that, really good source of lots of useful kind of background information as well. Or you might have local organisations, national bodies, national parks, authorities who publish quite a lot of information. So this example here, Managing Land for Carbon, is a guide published by the Lake District National Park, kind of giving a nice little overview for farmers of how they can capture more carbon, and talks about how they can capture it. So you might find local organisations, councils, anyone who manages a local nature reserve to you might have information published about what they're trying to do to maybe capture more carbon within their landscape, or manage the loss of carbon from their landscape. So organisations like that are really useful places to head to as well. So as I said, national parks, councils. If you live near an AONB, an area of outstanding natural beauty, they'll have some sort of management plan in place as well. People like the Forestry Commission and Environment Agency also have lots of information on their websites too. So by me, kind of bringing it local to you, it might be a nice idea to have a little think about what sort of environments you have near you, and we can share some thoughts in the comments as well. So I'm very aware that not everyone will have environments like this immediately on their doorstep. If you do, lucky you. It's not be lovely to have that nearby. But you might have access to other carbon-rich environments, maybe some heathland if you live near that. So particularly in the south of England, places like the New Forest, huge amounts of kind of heathland around. You might just have kind of normal countryside near you, so traditional farmland with maybe woodland or village environments as well. Or you might live in a more urban environment, and remember there is still carbon stored in that environment as well. You've got hopefully parks nearby, tree planting in different locations. You've got soils in those parks as well. So there is quite a lot going on there as well. So even around your neighbourhood, if you were just to take a walk, you would, and thinking about this subject, you'll probably start to see all the different areas where carbon is stored within your local environment. Cool. So if you have got any ideas, if anyone think of any other ideas you might have near you, do throw a few ideas into the comments for a moment, and we can just have a little think. What environments do people actually have nearby them? And if someone has something I've not mentioned as well, do pop that in the comments as well. We'll see if there's any other ideas out there too. All right. So I'll let people ponder that question later into the day. So I mentioned there's a lot of, there's some particular website we have where you can get instructions on some of those methods I've mentioned. So the top one on the right there, FSC website for A-level students, that's geography-fieldwork.org. And then if you follow that through to A-level and carbon, you'll find quite a lot of methods that I've mentioned there. So everything from instructions for burning soil through to peat measurements, calculating the amount of carbon in a tree. You'll find all of that information out there. But hopefully this has given you some nice ideas there. Oh, I've got a nice comment. Yeah, so urban parkland will make a good focus for field trip and investigation work, definitely. Hope every town has some sort of big urban park. Depending on the different environments within it, you've definitely got at least 2 carbon stores in trees and the soil, maybe even more if you've got anything else in there. Yeah, hopefully people have found that interesting, and yeah, do download the presentation as well and flick back through it if you like to. Check the links in the notes section for some of those websites I've mentioned. So the UK Soil Observatory, National River Flow Archive. You'll find lots of information, useful secondary information in there, which can help build your investigation and kind of provide some of your context as well. Cool. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Richard. I hope everyone enjoyed that and found it useful. It was certainly a good introduction into how to use carbon for your NEA. I don't think there's any unanswered questions in the comments. I think you've probably addressed them all as we've gone along. But yeah, thank you for your time, Richard, and thank you to everyone who's joined us live. For those of you who are watching the recording, there will be a link to the presentation in the video description below the video. We hope to see you again next time for the next geo tutorial. And yeah, thank you very much.